The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the lecture hall, throwing golden patterns across the long rows of desks. Students shuffled in with notebooks and laptops, settling into their usual spots. The air carried that quiet murmur of a new day at university, half excitement, half fatigue. At the front of the room, the professor adjusted his glasses and tapped the edge of his desk with a piece of chalk, signaling for silence. He was a man who liked order. He liked control. And above all, he liked to remind his students who was in charge. Today, his eyes landed on someone new, a student who had joined only a few days earlier. He sat near the middle of the room, quiet, focused, not drawing much attention to himself. His clothes were simple, his backpack neatly placed at his feet. He didn't whisper to classmates or scroll through his phone like many others. He just sat there looking straight ahead, calm and alert. The professor's gaze lingered a little longer than usual. Something about the stillness of the student seemed to bother him. In a class of nearly 100, most tried to blend in or avoid eye contact. This one, however, looked unshaken. That alone was enough to spark the professor's curiosity, and perhaps a bit of skepticism. Clearing his throat, the professor began his lecture. His voice was sharp, every sentence clipped like the crack of chalk on a board. He wrote out a complex equation across the blackboard, explaining each symbol as though he were unveiling a puzzle. Students leaned forward, pens racing to keep up. Some frowned, already falling behind, while others simply gave up and waited for the slides that would eventually be posted online. The professor paused midway, turning to face the room. His eyes scanned for signs of attention, and once again they landed on the quiet student. "You there," he said suddenly, pointing with his chalk. The room stilled. Dozens of eyes turned toward the student in the middle row. The young man lifted his gaze slowly, not startled, not nervous. He simply looked at the professor, waiting. "Since you seem to be listening so carefully," the professor said, his tone edged with challenge, "why don't you solve the rest of this problem for the class?" A ripple of whispers moved through the rows. It wasn't unusual for the professor to put students on the spot, but it was always uncomfortable. Some students froze, some stammered, some tried to laugh it off. That was the professor's style. Push hard, see who cracked. And today it was this new student's turn. The young man stood slowly, adjusting his notebook on the desk before rising. His movement was calm, measured. The professor raised an eyebrow. He expected hesitation, maybe panic. But what he saw instead was composure. "Come to the board," the professor instructed. The student walked forward, his steps steady. A few students leaned to their friends, whispering bets on whether he would crash and burn. Others simply looked on with pity, knowing how the professor loved to embarrass anyone who slipped up. The chalk was handed to him. For a moment he stood facing the board, his back to the class. The equation stretched halfway across the black surface, dense with symbols and numbers. "Go on," the professor said, folding his arms. "Show us what you've got." The student didn't speak right away. He studied the problem, eyes moving across the lines like someone reading a familiar passage from a book. Then with a smooth motion he began writing. His handwriting was clear, each symbol precise. Step by step he filled in the missing parts of the solution. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. The chalk glided across the board as though he already knew where it needed to go. The class watched in silence. The usual nervous scratching of pen stopped. Even the professor, who normally interrupted with corrections, stayed quiet. After several lines, the student set the chalk down gently and turned back to face the room. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, as though this had been no more difficult than tying his shoes. The professor walked closer, scanning the solution. His eyes moved line by line, checking for flaws. Instead of errors, he found clarity. The steps were correct, even elegant in their simplicity. For a moment he was taken aback. "Well," the professor said slowly, clearing his throat, "it seems you got it right." A small murmur spread through the students. Some raised their eyebrows, impressed. Others looked at the new student with fresh curiosity. The professor, however, wasn't ready to let it go. "Interesting," he said, narrowing his eyes. "But anyone can memorize a formula. Let's try something a little more challenging." He quickly erased a section of the board and replaced it with a different problem, one that required not only memory, but deeper understanding. It was the kind of question he usually reserved for graduate students or research discussions. not for undergraduates in a general lecture. He stepped back and gestured to the student. "Now solve this." The room tensed again. The whispers started back up, though softer this time. The young man didn't move right away. He studied the board, his eyes scanning each line, absorbing it silently. His lips moved just slightly, as though repeating the problem in his mind. Then he picked up the chalk again. This time he wrote faster, as though the solution was already laid out in his mind, and he only needed his hand to catch up. The professor crossed his arms tighter, watching with both irritation and intrigue. Line after line appeared on the board. No pauses, no second guessing. When he finished, he underlined the final answer neatly and set the chalk down once more. Then he turned, his face calm, almost humble, as though this was nothing unusual. The professor stepped forward again, scanning the work. He checked, rechecked, then glanced back at the student. Not a single mistake. Every step was precise. The silence in the lecture hall grew heavy. The professor, a man who prided himself on being the smartest voice in the room, found himself momentarily speechless. "Impressive," he said at last, though the word came out more grudgingly than he intended. The student gave a small nod and returned to his seat without a word. The room followed him with their eyes, some with admiration, others with disbelief. The professor, meanwhile, turned back to the board, trying to regain control of the lecture. But inside, something had shifted. He had meant to test the new student, perhaps even humble him, but instead, he had been caught off guard. As the class went on, the professor's mind kept drifting back to that moment, the way the student had solved both problems with such ease, without even breaking a sweat. It wasn't normal. It wasn't something you saw every day, and though the professor didn't say it out loud, one thought began to take root in his mind. This student was not ordinary. Not at all. The bell rang at the end of the lecture. Students packed up, buzzing with conversation, some still talking about what they had just witnessed. The young man slipped his notebook into his bag and walked out quietly, the same calm expression on his face. He didn't linger for praise or attention. He simply left, as if solving those problems had been nothing remarkable at all. The professor stayed behind, erasing the board slowly. His mind replayed the scene over and over. He had tried to test the student, but in truth it was he who had been tested. And deep down, though he wouldn't admit it yet, he knew he had just encountered someone extraordinary. The next class came 2 days later. The same lecture hall filled with the same shuffle of shoes, the scrape of chairs, and the chatter of students carrying coffees and half-finished conversations. But this time, there was a different kind of energy in the room. People remembered what had happened before. They remembered how the new student had stood up, walked calmly to the board, and solved problems that left the professor silent. The story had already spread beyond the class. Students from other departments had heard about it. Whispers filled the hallway even before the lecture started. The young man walked in quietly, just as he had before. His steps were unhurried, his expression the same calm mask. He carried his notebook under his arm and sat in his usual spot. A few students glanced his way, nudging their friends to notice. Some gave him curious looks, some impressed, some doubtful. It was as if the entire room was waiting for a repeat performance, hoping to see whether the first time had been a fluke or the start of something remarkable. At the front, the professor was already writing across the board when the student sat down. He did not greet the class right away. His movements were sharper than usual, the chalk hitting the board with extra force. His pride was still stung. From the last session, though he would never admit it openly, a professor was supposed to command respect, not be outshone by a student in front of everyone. When he finally turned around, his eyes scanned the rows, pausing briefly where the young man sat. The professor cleared his throat, his voice carrying the same sharp authority as always. But there was something else this time, an edge of challenge, a tone that seemed directed more at one student than at the whole class. He began the lecture, moving through difficult concepts, his words coming faster than usual, as though daring the students to keep up. Most struggled, scribbling notes frantically. The equations piled up on the board until the symbols blurred together. Some students leaned back in their chairs, giving up entirely, their pens frozen above empty pages. And yet, When the professor glanced back toward the middle row, he saw the new student sitting as calmly as before, his eyes fixed on the board, not a flicker of panic in his expression. His notebook was open, but he wasn't rushing to copy everything. He seemed to be absorbing it in a different way, almost as if the board was a book he had read before. The professor narrowed his eyes. He could feel the attention of the class drifting again, waiting for him to test the same student. And he decided he would not disappoint them. "You," he said suddenly, his voice echoing. "Stand up." The room fell into silence, every eye turning again toward the young man. He stood without hesitation, notebook left behind on the desk. "Let's see how much you were really listening," the professor said. He pointed at a fresh section of the board where a long equation stretched across the surface. "Tell the class the principle behind this formula. Don't just solve it. Explain it." This was different. It wasn't a question with one neat solution. It was a request for understanding, for depth, for clarity. Many students shrank in their chairs, relieved it wasn't them. Even some of the brightest looked nervous just hearing the question. But the young man did not look nervous. He walked forward again, his steps even, his face calm. He stood by the board and looked at the formula, his eyes scanning it once. Then he turned to face the class. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear. He began by breaking the equation into pieces, describing what each part represented, connecting it to ideas from earlier lectures and even earlier textbooks. He spoke in simple words, not like someone showing off, but like someone teaching. He didn't rush. His pace was measured, and the class followed along without feeling lost. Students leaned forward, some with wide eyes, realizing they were understanding concepts that had seemed impossible only minutes earlier. The young man's explanation flowed like water, each sentence leading smoothly to the next. He added small examples, real-world references that made the abstract formula feel alive. The professor stood frozen for a moment, then forced himself to lean against the desk, arms crossed tightly. He was listening too, though he tried not to show it. The depth of the explanation was undeniable. It wasn't memorized, it wasn't rehearsed. It was insight, real and clear. By the time the young man finished, the room was silent. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of being stunned. For once, everyone had actually followed the logic from start to end. The professor's mouth tightened, his jaw clenching slightly. "Not bad," he said at last, though the words sounded grudging. "But let's see if you can handle this." He turned back to the board and began writing again, faster this time, covering the surface with a problem that stretched beyond what most students had ever seen. It was layered, complex, pulling from multiple fields of study. He didn't explain it. He simply wrote and stepped aside. "Go on, solve it." The young man faced the board again, his eyes scanned it once, twice. Then he picked up the chalk and began. His hand moved with steady rhythm, as if the solution was already unfolding in his mind. He wrote quickly but not carelessly. Each line followed the next like stepping stones across a river. Minutes passed. The board filled with numbers, symbols, explanations in neat handwriting. The students were mesmerized, their eyes darting from the board to the professor, waiting for him to stop it or correct it, but he didn't. He just stood there, his face tightening with every passing moment. Finally, the young man set the chalk down and underlined the last line. He stepped back, his expression unchanged, as if he had done nothing unusual. The professor walked forward, scanning the solution with sharp eyes. He checked one step, then another, then another. His silence stretched on, the class holding its breath. It was flawless. The professor felt his chest tighten. He wanted to find a mistake, some slip that would let him reclaim control. But there was none. Every part was correct, precise and clear. The whispers started again in the room, spreading like a wave. Some students smiled, others shook their heads in disbelief. The quiet student had not only solved the impossible problem, but had done so without faltering, without showing strain. The professor turned to face him, his lips pressed in a thin line. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he said, "Sit down." The young man nodded once and returned to his seat. He didn't bask in the attention. He didn't look around to see the admiration in people's eyes. He simply sat back down, picked up his notebook, and opened it again, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the extraordinary had happened. The entire class knew it. And so did the professor. The lecture dragged on, though most students barely listened anymore. Their minds were on what they had just seen. The professor's voice carried on, but it no longer had the same weight. Something had shifted in the balance of the room. When the bell rang, students rushed out, buzzing with conversation. Some tried to catch up to the young man, asking how he had done it. But he moved quietly through the crowd, polite but reserved, slipping away without fanfare. The professor remained behind again, staring at the empty board. His pride wrestled with something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. He had always believed he was the authority, the sharpest mind in the room. But now that belief was cracking. He had tested the student twice, and twice the student had risen higher than expected. And though the professor told himself it was luck or memory or some trick deep inside, he knew it was something more, something he could not ignore. The next lecture hall was fuller than usual. Word had spread quickly across the campus. Students who weren't even enrolled in the class slipped in and filled the back rows, eager to see what might happen this time. There was a sense of anticipation, a quiet tension that hummed through the room before the professor even arrived. Everyone wanted to know if the new student would be tested again, and if so, what he would do next. When the young man walked in, his expression was the same calm mask he always wore. He didn't look at the crowd that was larger than before, nor at the curious faces that turned toward him. He carried his notebook, his step steady, and took his usual seat as if nothing unusual was happening. But everyone else knew it was unusual. They had seen brilliance, and brilliance always drew attention. The professor entered moments later, his posture straighter than usual, his face set with a stern determination. He could feel the energy in the room. He could sense that the class was not just here to learn today, but to watch. Watch him, watch the student, and perhaps watch the balance of power in the lecture hall shift once more. He would not let himself be embarrassed again. He had prepared. As the lecture began, his voice was sharper, his explanations more detailed. He spoke quickly, filling the board with layered problems, definitions, and concepts. His chalk tapped rapidly, leaving trails of white dust as he pushed through material that would normally take weeks to cover. Some students frowned, their pens struggling to keep up, but he wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking to one student in particular, and everyone knew it. Halfway through the lecture, he stopped suddenly, dropping the chalk onto the tray with a sharp click. He turned, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto the quiet student in the middle row. "You," he said firmly, his voice echoing across the hall. "Come forward." The silence was immediate. The shuffling of papers, the whispers, the tapping of pens, all of it stopped. The young man stood slowly, his face calm as ever, and walked to the front. "This isn't about solving equations today," the professor said. "Let's see if you can explain the connections. I want you to tell the class how this subject links to other fields. Physics, history, even philosophy, if you can manage it. If you're as sharp as everyone thinks, let's see you prove it." The challenge was clear. It was no longer about solving a problem. It was about understanding at a level beyond what most students and even some teachers could manage. The professor crossed his arms, waiting, his eyes fixed on the student. The young man turned slowly toward the board, reading the dense symbols and terms that had been written earlier. Then he turned back to face the class. He began to speak. His voice was calm and steady, carrying easily to the back of the room. At first, he explained the problem in front of them, breaking it down into simple ideas that anyone could follow. Then, without pause, he connected it to another principle from physics, drawing a line between two concepts that rarely shared the same discussion. Students leaned forward, following his words as if they were watching puzzle pieces click together. Then he shifted. He spoke about the history of the concept, how scientists centuries ago had debated it, how their experiments had shaped not only mathematics, but also the way people saw the world. His recall was exact. He cited dates, names, and experiments without hesitation, painting a picture that made the lecture hall feel less like a classroom and more like a living story. And then, with a smooth turn, he connected it to philosophy. He spoke about how the formula on the board wasn't just numbers and letters, but a reflection of how humans tried to describe the invisible forces of the world. He quoted thinkers and compared their ideas to the modern equations. It was not memorized, not rehearsed. It was insight spoken with a clarity that held the room captive. The professor's face tightened as he listened. His challenge had been meant to push the student into a corner, but instead the student was expanding the corner into a wide-open space. The room was silent except for the student's voice, each sentence layering on the one before it like carefully placed bricks. Minutes passed, though it didn't feel like it. When the young man finally paused, the class was still, every eye on him. He had explained, connected, and illuminated in a way none of them had heard before. A small wave of whispers moved through the rows. Some students smiled, others shook their heads in disbelief. The professor cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice before speaking. "That was thorough," he said, though the words came reluctantly. "But let's not confuse a good memory with real understanding." He grabbed a piece of chalk and wrote quickly, his hand moving with urgency. This time he didn't just write a problem. He built a chain of problems, each one feeding into the next. It was a web of logic, designed to be impossible to complete without deep reasoning. He turned to the student. "Work through this, all of it. If you truly understand, you'll see how the pieces connect." The young man picked up the chalk again. He studied the board silently for a few seconds. Then, with the same calm confidence as before, he began. His hand moved quickly, but not frantically. Each step flowed into the next, the chain of logic unfolding smoothly. He didn't just solve each problem. He explained aloud as he wrote, describing why each step mattered, how each answer linked to the next, as if guiding the entire class through a maze he already knew the way out of. The professor stepped closer, watching with sharp eyes. But as the board filled with more and more correct steps, his face darkened. The young man's explanation was not only accurate, it was clearer than his own lectures. The students understood. They were nodding, writing eagerly, eyes lit with the joy of actually following something that usually felt impossible. Finally, the student underlined the final answer at the bottom of the board and set the chalk down. He turned to face the class, his expression calm, almost humble, as though this had been no different from solving a simple homework problem. The room erupted with whispers, some even clapping quietly before stopping themselves. They knew what they had just witnessed was rare, maybe even historic in their lives as students. The professor stood stiff, his pride wounded deeper than before. He wanted to dismiss it, to pretend it wasn't as extraordinary as it seemed. But he couldn't. He had watched it happen with his own eyes. He had heard the clarity in the explanations. He forced himself to speak. "That will be all," he said, his tone clipped. "Sit down." The young man nodded and returned to his seat without a word. The attention followed him, dozens of pairs of eyes filled with admiration, curiosity, even awe, but he didn't react. He simply opened his notebook again as if none of it mattered. The professor turned back to the board, erasing it quickly, though his hand trembled slightly. For the rest of the lecture, his words were flatter, his pace slower. He could feel the shift in the room. Students who once hung on his every word were now comparing him silently to the quiet genius in the middle row. When the class ended, students didn't rush out the way they usually did. They lingered, talking in small groups, replaying what had just happened. Some tried to approach the young man, but he slipped out quietly, blending into the crowd as if he had not just stunned an entire lecture hall again. The professor stayed behind, staring at the half-erased chalk marks on the board. His chest felt heavy. He had thought he was testing the student, but with each passing challenge, it became clearer. The student was the one teaching everyone else what true understanding looked like. And though the professor hated to admit it, even to himself, he knew deep down that he was standing in the presence of a mind unlike any he had ever seen before. The lecture hall felt different that day, heavier somehow, as if everyone was carrying unspoken expectations. By now, the quiet student had already proven himself in ways no one could ignore. Each class, he was tested, and each time, he not only answered but went beyond what was asked, revealing layers of knowledge that left the entire room in awe. What had started as curiosity had grown into a kind of anticipation. Students arrived earlier than usual, finding their seats just to make sure they wouldn't miss a moment. When the professor walked in, his expression was tight, his eyes sharp. He set his books down harder than necessary, as if the sound alone could command attention. He glanced around the room, noticing how many extra faces were there now, people who weren't officially enrolled but had slipped in just to see what might unfold. He felt the weight of their stares pressing on him, waiting for him to engage the student again. The truth was, the professor had been restless ever since their last exchange. His pride, something he had carried for years like a shield, was shaken. He had always believed that no student could rise to his level of command in his own classroom. Yet, here was someone who seemed to do it effortlessly, not with arrogance, but with a calm certainty that unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. He began the lecture as usual, his chalk moving quickly across the board. He filled it with complex expressions, weaving together ideas that demanded focus and patience. His words were clipped, his tone harder than before. But as he spoke, he caught himself glancing again and again at the middle row, at the quiet figure sitting straight, notebook open, eyes following every line without strain. It was that composure that unsettled him most. Other students squirmed, whispered, or gave up halfway through. But this student never looked lost. Never once. He sat there as if the lecture was unfolding exactly as he expected it to, as if the board itself was nothing more than a page he had already read. Halfway through, the professor paused. His fingers tapped against the wooden desk. He looked directly at the young man. "You," he said, his voice echoing louder than intended. "Come here." The class hushed instantly. All eyes followed as the student rose calmly, placing his pen down neatly before walking to the front. The professor gestured toward the board where the chalky mark stretched like a maze. "Explain this entire sequence," the professor said. "Not just the steps. Tell us why it matters, where it comes from, and where it leads. And while you're at it, tell us what's wrong with it." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown to the floor. The students exchanged glances. It wasn't just a question, it was a trap. The professor had written something deliberately flawed, a series that looked convincing but carried hidden errors. Most students wouldn't notice until they were deep into it. Some might not notice at all. The young man studied the board quietly for a moment. Then he picked up the chalk. His first words came soft, but steady enough to fill the room. He began by breaking down the sequence exactly as written, line by line. He showed how it unfolded, what each part was meant to do, how the structure held together. Students leaned forward, following closely. Then, halfway through, he stopped. He circled one section with the chalk. "This part," he said calmly, "doesn't work the way it should. At first glance, it looks correct, but if you trace it back to the root definition, it breaks. The logic fails here." The professor's jaw tightened, but the student wasn't finished. He went on to not only explain why it was wrong, but also to rewrite it properly. He erased the flawed section and replaced it with clean, precise symbols. He kept talking as he wrote, his words flowing with clarity, guiding the room like a storyteller guiding an audience through a twisting tale. The corrected sequence filled the board, and then, instead of stopping, the student kept going. He showed what the corrected path could lead to, building connections that stretched into areas most students hadn't studied yet. His recall pulled from textbooks, journals, and even obscure references that few undergraduates would know. But the way he spoke made it accessible, even exciting. The room was silent except for the scratch of his chalk and the steady rhythm of his voice. For a while, it felt less like a lecture and more like a revelation. Students who had been slouched in their chairs were now sitting up straight, their pens flying across pages to capture every word. When he finally stepped back, the board was filled from end to end. Clean, logical, unbroken. He set the chalk down gently and turned to the class. His face was calm, humble even, as if what he had done was nothing remarkable. The professor walked closer, his eyes darting across the board, searching desperately for mistakes. His heart beat harder with each step he checked. But there were none. It was perfect, not only corrected but improved beyond what he himself had intended. The whispers spread again, louder this time. a ripple of amazement rolling through the room. Some students couldn't help but smile, others exchanged wide-eyed looks. For them, it was clear they were witnessing something rare, something they might never see again in their academic lives. The professor turned, his face flushed, though he tried to keep his voice even. "That will be all. Sit down." The young man nodded once and walked back to his seat, unbothered by the attention that followed him. He opened his notebook again as if nothing unusual had happened, his pen moving across the page with the same quiet rhythm as always. But the professor could not settle so easily. His pride was cracked open. He had intended to expose the student, to show that his earlier success was luck or simple memory. Instead, the student had shown something undeniable, an ability that stretched beyond memorization into a kind of vision. He had seen through the trick, corrected it, and expanded on it without breaking stride. For the rest of the lecture, the professor's words came slower, heavier. He could feel the difference in the room. The respect he once commanded so effortlessly was no longer his alone. It had shifted. The students now looked not only to him but also to the quiet figure in the middle row. When the bell rang, the room filled with the usual noise of students packing up, but the conversations were different. They weren't about homework or weekend plans. They were about what had just happened. Some stayed behind, whispering in small groups, replaying the moment when the flaw had been revealed so effortlessly. Others tried again to approach the student, but he slipped away quietly, disappearing into the hallway without fanfare. The professor remained behind once more, staring at the board, half erased, chalk dust clinging to the tray. His chest felt heavy, his thoughts tangled. He had tried to test the student again and again. It had backfired. It wasn't just intelligence. It was something deeper, something he had never encountered before. For the first time in years, the professor felt small in his own classroom, and though he hated to admit it, he knew the truth. The student's presence had changed everything. The day of the final lecture came, and the atmosphere in the hall was unlike anything the professor had ever experienced in his years of teaching. Students arrived early again, filling every seat with even more unfamiliar faces squeezing into corners and standing along the back wall. By now, the story had spread across the campus like wildfire. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was expectation. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen between the professor and the quiet student, who had already stunned the room several times before. The young man walked in the same way he always did. Calm, steady, carrying his notebook under his arm. His face showed no sign of excitement or nervousness, no awareness of the way people whispered as he passed. He simply took his usual seat in the middle row, placing his pen on the desk and waiting patiently. But the professor was not calm. He entered the room with shoulders stiff, his jaw tight. He had not slept well the night before, replaying every exchange in his mind. Each time he had tested the student, the outcome had left him shaken, left him questioning himself. And though he hated to admit it, a part of him dreaded what might happen today. He knew the class wasn't there for him anymore. They were there for the student. He began the lecture with his usual sharp tone, filling the board with problems and ideas. But even he could hear the lack of energy in his own voice. His words, once commanding, now felt heavy. He could sense the class waiting, restless, their attention divided. They weren't listening for him. They were waiting for the moment when he would inevitably turn toward the middle row. And then it came. He dropped the chalk onto the tray with a sharp sound and turned toward the student. "You," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "Come forward." The silence was instant. The young man stood and walked to the front just as he always had. He picked up the chalk and waited, calm and unshaken. The professor hesitated for a moment. His plan had been to ask a final, impossible question, something that would push the student beyond his limits. But standing there, looking at the calm figure in front of him, he felt something shift inside. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't pride. It was something closer to respect, though he struggled to name it. Finally, he gestured toward the board. "Explain this," he said, pointing to a complex problem he had already written earlier. "And if you can, show us something new, something beyond the textbook." The young man studied the board for a moment. Then he began. His chalk moved with the same steady rhythm, his voice carrying clearly through the room. He explained the problem step by step, in a way that was simple enough for everyone to follow. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. Every line of his solution unfolded like a story, each step flowing naturally into the next. But then he did something unexpected. He paused halfway, turned to the class, and instead of just finishing the problem, he began to talk about the bigger picture. He explained how the idea on the board wasn't just numbers, but part of a larger way of seeing the world. He connected it to patterns in nature, to discoveries in science, to ideas from centuries ago. He spoke about how knowledge wasn't just about solving equations, but about understanding how everything connected. His words were simple, but they carried weight. The students were silent, their eyes fixed on him, their pens forgotten. Even the professor found himself listening, really listening in a way he hadn't done in years. It felt less like a student explaining a formula, and more like someone opening a window, letting fresh air into a room that had grown stale. When he finally finished, the board was filled, but the silence in the room was fuller still. It was the kind of silence that came not from confusion but from awe. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began, at first soft, hesitant, then louder, filling the hall until the sound bounced off the walls. Students clapped, some even standing, their faces lit with admiration. It wasn't just for the solution on the board, it was for the clarity, the vision, the way the student had taken something difficult and made it feel alive. The young man stood quietly, waiting for the noise to settle. He didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't soak in the attention. He simply set the chalk down and walked back to his seat, as calm and humble as he had been on the very first day. The professor stood frozen for a moment. His chest was tight, his thoughts racing. He looked at the board, at the flawless work, at the student who had just sat down without fanfare. Something inside him cracked open, the last wall of pride he had been holding on to. For years he had believed that authority and knowledge belonged to him, that his role as professor made him untouchable. But here, in front of everyone, he had been shown something undeniable. True brilliance wasn't about control or power. It was about clarity, about the ability to see and share in ways others could not. And this student, the one he had tried to test, had shown it again and again. The professor drew in a slow breath. When the applause finally faded and the room quieted again, he spoke. His voice was softer now, without its usual edge. "I owe this student something," he said. "When I first called him forward, I did not expect what he could do. I wanted to test him, perhaps even embarrass him. But what I have seen instead is extraordinary, not once but every time." The room was silent again, but this time the silence was full of respect. "This," the professor continued, "is what true learning looks like. Not memorization, not fear of being wrong, but understanding, depth, vision. And today, we have all seen it." His words hung in the air, and for the first time the professor felt lighter. He was no longer fighting against the student. He was acknowledging him, respecting him. The bell rang, and students began to pack up, their conversations filled with excitement. They would remember this day for years, not just because of the brilliance they had witnessed, but because they had seen something rare, a teacher humbled, and a student quietly shining without arrogance. The young man left the room quietly, the same way he always did, slipping through the door without looking back. He carried no pride in his walk, no boast in his step. To him it had been just another day, another chance to learn and share, but to everyone else it was unforgettable. The professor sat alone after the room emptied, staring at the clean white marks across the blackboard. He thought about all the years he had stood in that spot, certain of his own authority. And he realized that sometimes genius does not announce itself with noise or pride. Sometimes it arrives quietly, sits in the middle row and waits for the moment to reveal itself. And when it does, it changes everything.